Abraham Lincoln.
The presidency of Abraham Lincoln began on March 4, 1861, when he was inaugurated as the 16th President of the United States, and ended upon his assassination and death on April 15, 1865, 42 days into his second term. Lincoln was the first member of the recently established Republican Party elected to the presidency. He was succeeded by Vice President Andrew Johnson. Lincoln presided over the Union victory in the American Civil War, which dominated his presidency. Lincoln took office following the 1860 presidential election, in which he won a plurality of the popular vote in a four-candidate field. Almost all of Lincoln's votes came from the northern United States, as the Republicans held little appeal to voters in the southern United States. A former Whig, Lincoln ran on a political platform opposed to the expansion of slavery in the territories. His election served as the immediate impetus for the outbreak of the Civil War. After being sworn in as president, Lincoln refused to accept any resolution that would result in Southern secession from the Union. The Civil War began weeks into Lincoln's presidency with the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter, a federal installation located within the boundaries of the Confederacy. Lincoln was called on to handle both the political and military aspects of the Civil War, facing challenges in both spheres. As commander-in-chief, he ordered the suspension of the constitutionally protected right to habeas corpus in the state of Maryland in order to suppress Confederate sympathizers. He also became the first president to institute a military draft. As the Union faced several early defeats in the Eastern Theater of the American Civil War, Lincoln cycled through numerous military commanders during the war, finally settling on General Ulysses S Grant, who had led the Union to several victories in the Western Theater. Lincoln's 1863 Emancipation Proclamation freed about 20,000 of slaves in Confederate-held territory, and established emancipation as a Union war goal. In 1865, Lincoln was instrumental in the passage of the 13th Amendment, which made slavery unconstitutional. Lincoln also presided over the passage of important domestic legislation, including the first of the Homestead Acts, the Morrill Land Grant Act of 1862, and the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862. He ran for re-election in 1864 on the National Union ticket, which was supported by war Democrats in addition to Republicans. Though Lincoln feared he might lose the contest, he defeated his former subordinate, General George B. McClellan of the Democratic Party, in a landslide. Months after the election, Grant would essentially end the war by defeating the Confederate Army led by General Robert E. Lee. Lincoln's assassination in April 1865, 5 days after the surrender of Lee, left the final challenge of reconstructing the nation to others. Following his death, Lincoln was portrayed as the liberator of the slaves, the savior of the Union, and a martyr for the cause of freedom. Political historians have long held Lincoln in high regard for his accomplishments and personal characteristics. Alongside George Washington and Franklin D. Roosevelt, he has been consistently ranked both by scholars and the public as one of the top 3 greatest presidents, often as number 1.
Andrew Johnson.
The presidency of Andrew Johnson began on April 15, 1865, when Andrew Johnson became President of the United States upon the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln, and ended on March 4, 1869. He had been Vice President of the United States for only 42 days when he succeeded to the presidency. The 17th United States President, Johnson was a member of the Democratic Party before the Civil War and had been Lincoln's 1864 running mate on the National Union ticket, which was supported by Republicans and war Democrats. Johnson took office as the Civil War came to a close, and his presidency was dominated by the aftermath of the war. As president, Johnson attempted to build his own party of Southerners and conservative Northerners, but he was unable to unite his supporters into a new party. Republican Ulysses S Grant succeeded Johnson as president. Johnson, who was himself from Tennessee, favored quick restoration of the seceded states to the Union. He implemented his own form of presidential reconstruction, a series of proclamations directing the seceded states to hold conventions and elections to reform their civil governments. His plans did not give protection to the former slaves, and he came into conflict with the Republican-dominated Congress. When Southern states returned, many of their old leaders passed black codes to deprive the freedmen of many civil liberties. Congressional Republicans refused to seat legislators from those states and established military districts across the South. Johnson vetoed their bills, and congressional Republicans overrode him, setting a pattern for the remainder of his presidency. Frustrated by Johnson's actions, Congress proposed the 14th Amendment to the states, and the amendment was ratified in 1868. As the conflict between the branches of government grew, Congress passed the Tenure of Office Act, restricting Johnson's ability to fire cabinet officials. When he persisted in trying to dismiss Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, he was impeached by the House of Representatives, making him the first U.S. president to be impeached. Johnson narrowly avoided conviction in the Senate and removal from office, but he exercised little power in his last year in office. In foreign policy, Johnson presided over the purchase of Alaska, and his presidency saw the end of the French intervention in Mexico. Having broken with Republicans, and failing to establish his own party under the National Union banner, Johnson sought the 1868 Democratic presidential nomination, but it went to Horatio Seymour instead. Seymour's defeat by Grant in the 1868 presidential election left Northern Republicans firmly in control of Reconstruction. Though he was held in high esteem by the Dunning School of Historians, more recent historians rank Johnson among the worst American presidents for his frequent clashes with Congress, strong opposition to federally guaranteed rights for African Americans, and general ineffectiveness as president.
Ulysses S. Grant.
The presidency of Ulysses S. Grant began on March 4, 1869, when Ulysses S. Grant was inaugurated as the 18th President of the United States, and ended on March 4, 1877. Grant took office in the aftermath of the Civil War, and he presided over much of the Reconstruction era. A Republican, Grant became president after defeating Democrat Horatio Seymour in the 1868 presidential election. He was re-elected in 1872 in a landslide victory, overcoming a split in the Republican Party that resulted in the formation of the Liberal Republicans, which nominated Horace Greeley to oppose him. He was succeeded as president by Republican Rutherford B Hayes after the contested 1876 presidential election. Reconstruction took precedence during Grant's 2 terms of office. The Ku Klux Klan caused widespread violence throughout the South against African Americans. By 1870, all former Confederate states had been readmitted into the United States and were represented in Congress. However, Democrats, or former slave owners, violently refused to accept that freedmen were citizens, who were granted suffrage by the 15th Amendment. By 1871, Klan activity was becoming out of control, while Grant and Congress created the Department of Justice and had passed 3 Force Acts. Grant and his Attorney General Amos T. Ackerman began a crackdown on Klan in the South, starting in South Carolina, making arrests and convictions, causing the Klan to demobilize and ensuring a fair election for 1872. Rather than develop a cadre of trustworthy political advisors, Grant was self-reliant in choosing his cabinet. He relied heavily on former Army associates, who had a thin understanding of politics and a weak sense of civilian ethics. Numerous scandals plagued his administration, including allegations of bribery, fraud, and cronyism. In 1872, Grant signed into law an act of Congress that established Yellowstone National Park, the nation's first national park. A strong economy, reduction of the national debt, federal spending, tariffs, and the federal workforce aided Grant in getting re-elected. Congress established a de facto deflationary gold standard that reduced the number of greenbacks in the national economy. However, financial overinvestment in railroad construction caused the Panic of 1873 and economic turmoil. The long depression that followed, and Grant's veto of an inflation bill, turned public opinion against him. Democrats regained control of the House in the 1874 elections. While scandals escalated, reformers appointed by Grant were able to clean up some federal departments. Most notably, Secretary of the Treasury Benjamin Bristow prosecuted the whiskey ring, leading to the indictment of Grant's personal secretary, Orville E. Babcock. Grant continued to support Reconstruction, and he signed the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which banned discrimination in public accommodations. Secretary of War William W. Belknap suddenly resigned office in February 1876, afterwards impeached by the House for taking kickbacks. When Grant left office in 1877, Redeemers controlled all Southern state governments. The United States was at peace with the world throughout Grant's 8 years in office, but his handling of foreign policy was uneven. Tensions with Native American tribes in the West continued. Under the talented Secretary of State Hamilton Fish, the Treaty of Washington restored relations with Britain and resolved the contentious Alabama claims, while the Virginius affair with Spain was settled peacefully. Grant attempted to annex the Caribbean island of Santo Domingo, but the annexation was blocked by the Senate. With the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, the West was wide open to expansionism that sometimes was challenged by hostile Native Americans. Grant pursued a peace policy with Native Americans, but persistent Western expansion by settlers made conflict difficult to avoid. Grant presided over the Great Sioux War of 1876 and other clashes with the Native Americans. Grant's presidency was traditionally denounced by historians due to corruption charges among subordinates, despite efforts of reform in his administration. His presidential reputation has greatly risen over the past few decades among historians who have noted that Grant advanced a modern presidency that included a reformed Indian policy, African American civil rights, the first Civil Service Commission, and protected women under federal law.
Rutherford B Hayes.
The presidency of Rutherford B Hayes began on March 4, 1877, when Rutherford B Hayes was inaugurated as President of the United States, and ended on March 4, 1881. Hayes became the 19th president, after being awarded the closely contested 1876 presidential election by Republicans in Congress who agreed to the Compromise of 1877. That compromise promised to pull federal troops out of the South, thus ending Reconstruction. He refused to seek re-election and was succeeded by James A. Garfield, a fellow Republican and ally. In general, he was a moderate and a pragmatist. He kept the promise to withdraw the last federal troops from the South, as Democrats took control of the last 3 Republican states. A paragon of honesty, he sponsored civil service reform, where he challenged the patronage-hungry Republican politicians. Though he failed to enact long-term reform, he helped generate public support for the eventual passage of the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act in 1883. The Republican Party in the South grew steadily weaker as his efforts to support the civil rights of blacks in the South were largely stymied by Democrats in Congress. Insisting that maintenance of the gold standard was essential to economic recovery, he opposed greenbacks, paper money not backed by gold or silver, and vetoed the Bland-Allison Act that called for more silver in the money supply. Congress overrode his veto, but Hayes's monetary policy forged a compromise between inflationists and advocates of hard money. He used federal troops cautiously to avoid violence in the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, one of the largest labor strikes in U.S. history. It marked the end of the economic depression called the Panic of 1873. Prosperity marked the rest of his term. His policy toward Native Americans emphasized minimizing fraud. He continued Grant's peace plan and anticipated the assimilationist program of the Dawes Act of 1887. In foreign policy, he was a moderate who took few initiatives. He unsuccessfully opposed the de Lesseps plan for building a Panama Canal, which he thought should be an American-only program. Hayes asserted U.S. influence in Latin America and the continuing primacy of the Monroe Doctrine. Polls of historians and political scientists generally rank Hayes as an average president.
James Abram Garfield.
The presidency of James A. Garfield began with his inauguration on March 4, 1881 and ended on September 19, 1881 with his death from wounds inflicted by an assassin. By the time of his election, Garfield had begun to see education rather than the ballot box as the best hope for improving the lives of African Americans. In his inaugural speech he said, "The elevation of the Negro race from slavery to the full rights of citizenship is the most important political change we have known since the adoption of the Constitution of 1787. No thoughtful man can fail to appreciate its beneficent effect upon our institutions and people. It has liberated the master as well as the slave from a relation which wronged and enfeebled both." Garfield tried to put together a cabinet that would appease all factions of the Republican Party, but, prompted by his Secretary of State, Blaine, he eventually challenged Conkling's patronage machine in New York. Instead of appointing one of Conkling's friends as collector of the Port of New York, Garfield chose a Blaine protege, prompting the resignation of an outraged Conkling and strengthening the independence and power of the presidency. So demanding were the office seekers and the pressures of the patronage system that at one point Garfield wondered why anyone would want to seek the presidency. "My God," he exclaimed, "what is there in this place that a man should ever want to get into it?" The other significant development of Garfield's short term of office, the Star Route scandal, involved the fraudulent dispersal of postal route contracts. "Go ahead regardless of where or whom you hit," Garfield told investigators. "I direct you not only to probe this ulcer to the bottom, but to cut it out." Despite such strong talk, Grant accused Garfield of having the backbone of an angleworm. On July 2, 1881, after only 4 months in office, while on his way to a family vacation in New England, Garfield was shot twice in the railroad station in Washington, D.C., by Charles J. Guiteau, a disappointed office seeker with messianic visions. The first shot only grazed Garfield's arm, but the second bullet pierced his back and lodged behind his pancreas. In a letter dated November 1880, Garfield had written, "Assassination can be no more guarded against than death by lightning, and it is not best to worry about either." Guiteau peaceably surrendered to police, calmly announcing, "I am a stalwart." Chester A. Arthur is now President of the United States. Garfield lived until September 19 after the shooting, making some improvements, but doctors were never able to find the bullet that entered his back, even employing Alexander Graham Bell to search for it using a crude metal detector. Inevitably, better medical procedures would have likely led to Garfield's survival.
Chester Alan Arthur.
The presidency of Chester A. Arthur began on September 19, 1881, when Arthur became the 21st President of the United States upon the assassination and death of President James A. Garfield, and ended on March 4, 1885. Arthur, a Republican, had been Vice President of the United States for only 199 days when he succeeded to the presidency. In ill health and lacking the full support of his party by the end of his term, Arthur made only a token effort for the Republican nomination in the 1884 presidential election. He was succeeded by Democrat Grover Cleveland. Garfield chose Arthur as his running mate in the 1880 United States presidential election due to the latter's association with the Republican Party's stalwart faction, and Arthur struggled to overcome his reputation as a New York City machine politician. He embraced the cause of U.S. civil service reform, and his advocacy and enforcement of the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act became the centerpiece of his administration. Though patronage remained a powerful force in politics, the Pendleton Act laid the foundations for a professional civil service that would emerge in subsequent decades. Facing a budget surplus, Arthur signed the Tariff of 1883, which reduced tariffs. He also vetoed the Rivers and Harbors Act, an act that would have appropriated federal funds in a manner he thought excessive, and oversaw a building program for the United States Navy. After the Supreme Court struck down the Civil Rights Act of 1875, Arthur favored new civil rights legislation to protect African Americans, but was unable to win passage of a new bill. In foreign policy, Arthur pursued closer economic and political relations with Latin America, but many of his proposed trade agreements were defeated in the United States Senate. The 1884 Republican National Convention passed over Arthur in favor of James G. Blaine, but Cleveland defeated Blaine in the 1884 presidential election. Although Arthur's failing health and political temperament combined to make his administration less active than a modern presidency, he earned praise among contemporaries for his solid performance in office. Journalist Alexander McClure later wrote, "No man ever entered the presidency so profoundly and widely distrusted as Chester Alan Arthur, and no one ever retired, more generally respected, alike by political friend and foe." Since his death, Arthur's reputation has mostly faded from the public consciousness. Although some have praised his flexibility and willingness to embrace reform, present-day historians and scholars generally rank him as a below-average president.
Stephen Grover Cleveland.
The first presidency of Grover Cleveland lasted from March 4, 1885 to March 4, 1889. The first Democrat elected after the Civil War, Grover Cleveland is the only president of the United States to leave office after one term and later return for a second term. His first presidency was the nation's 22nd. Cleveland defeated James G. Blaine of Maine in 1884. Cleveland won the 1884 election with the support of a reform-minded group of Republicans known as mugwumps, and he expanded the number of government positions that were protected by the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act. He also vetoed several bills designed to provide pensions and other benefits to various regions and individuals. In response to anti-competitive practices by railroads, Cleveland signed the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887, which established the first independent federal agency. During his first term, he unsuccessfully sought the repeal of the Bland-Allison Act and a lowering of the tariff. The Samoan crisis was the major foreign policy event of Cleveland's first term, and that crisis ended with the tripartite protectorate in the Samoan Islands. Cleveland entered office a bachelor, and his sister Rose Cleveland served as White House hostess. He soon met 21-year-old Frances Folsom, and married her in 1886, making him only the second president to marry while in office, and the first to actually be married in the White House. In the election of 1888 he lost to Republican Benjamin Harrison of Indiana. He would run again in 1892 against Harrison, winning and become the only president to date to serve two separate non-consecutive terms. Historians generally rank Cleveland's first presidency as average.
Benjamin Harrison.
The presidency of Benjamin Harrison began on March 4, 1889, when Benjamin Harrison was inaugurated as President of the United States, and ended on March 4, 1893. Harrison, a Republican, took office as the 23rd United States President after defeating Democratic incumbent President Grover Cleveland in the 1888 election. 4 years later he was defeated for re-election by Cleveland in the 1892 presidential election. Harrison is the only president to be preceded and succeeded by the same individual. Harrison is also the only president to be the grandson of another president. Harrison and the Republican-controlled 51st United States Congress, derided by opponents as the Billion-Dollar Congress, enacted the most ambitious domestic agenda of the late 19th century. Hallmarks of his administration include the McKinley Tariff, which imposed historic protective trade rates, and the Sherman Antitrust Act, which empowered the federal government to investigate and prosecute trusts. Due in large part to surplus revenues from the tariffs, federal spending reached $1 billion for the first time during his term. Harrison facilitated the creation of the national forests through an amendment to the General Revision Act, 1891, and substantially strengthened and modernized the United States Navy. He proposed, in vain, federal education funding as well as voting rights enforcement for African Americans in the South. Harrison's presidency saw the addition of 6 new states, more than any other president. In foreign affairs, Harrison vigorously promoted American exports, sought tariff reciprocity in Latin America, and worked to increase U.S. influence across the Pacific. In 1889, during the first year of his presidency, President Benjamin Harrison gave a speech regarding the First Pan-American Congress. As he spoke, his voice was recorded by an Edison phonograph wax cylinder, and he became the first president to have his voice recorded and kept. It is the oldest known recording of a U.S. president's voice. Here is the audio.
President of the United States, I was president of the First Pan-American Congress in Washington, D.C. Believe that with God's help, our two countries shall continue to live side by side in peace and prosperity. Benjamin Harrison.
Although many historians have praised Harrison's personal integrity and commitment to minority voting rights, scholars and historians generally rank Harrison in the bottom half of U.S. presidents. Nonetheless, Harrison's ambitious domestic policy and assertive foreign policy set a precedent for the more powerful presidencies of the 20th century.
Stephen Grover Cleveland.
Economic events and challenges became a major focus of Cleveland's historic second presidency. In 1893, Cleveland forced the withdrawal of a treaty that would have annexed Hawaii because he felt the United States was wrong in helping with the overthrow of Queen Liliuokalani. An economic depression began called the Panic of 1893. Thousands of businesses went under and riots broke out. However, the government did little to help because it was not seen as constitutionally allowed. A strong believer in the gold standard, Cleveland called Congress into session to repeal the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. According to this act, silver was purchased by the government and was redeemable in notes for either silver or gold. Cleveland's belief that this was responsible for reducing the gold reserves was not popular with many in the Democratic Party. In 1894, the Pullman strike occurred. The Pullman Palace Car Company had reduced wages and the workers walked out under the leadership of Eugene V. Debs. When violence broke out, Cleveland ordered federal troops in and arrested Debs, thus ending the strike. Cleveland retired from active political life in 1897 and moved to Princeton, New Jersey. He became a lecturer and member of the Board of Trustees of Princeton University. Cleveland died on June 24, 1908, of heart failure. Cleveland is considered by historians to have been one of America's better presidents. During his time in office, He helped usher in the beginning of federal regulation of commerce. Further, he fought against what he saw as private abuses of federal money. He was known for acting upon his own conscience despite opposition within his party.